10 serial killers on why they did it, in their own words. Welcome to Creepshow. Today, we're taking an unsettling journey into the minds of some of the world's most infamous killers, in their own words. What compels someone to commit the unthinkable? What twisted motivations lie beneath these horrific acts? From deep-rooted trauma to disturbed rationalizations, each of these killers has attempted to explain their actions. Join me as we explore 10 serial killers and the disturbing reasons they gave for their crimes. Serial killers hold a dark fascination. We're drawn to their stories, compelled by a mix of horror and curiosity, seeking to understand the incomprehensible. Though it's likely impossible to truly grasp what drives someone to kill, some have tried to explain their motives, offering rare glimpses into their fractured minds. Number 10. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer's descent into violence and darkness remains one of the most haunting tales of the modern era. Over a span of 13 years, Dahmer committed a series of murders that went beyond killing. His crimes included rape, dismemberment, and even cannibalism, each act driven by a deeply rooted need for control and an insatiable desire to dominate. When asked why he did it, Dahmer's answer was chilling in its detachment. The killing was just a means to an end. The path that led Dahmer to his horrific acts began in a turbulent childhood. Born in Milwaukee in 1960, Dahmer was raised in a home marked by tension and emotional distance. His parents' strained relationship, which eventually led to divorce, left young Jeffrey isolated, with few emotional connections and a deep sense of abandonment. From an early age, he exhibited a disturbing fascination with death, collecting animal carcasses and even dissecting roadkill. These behaviors, though alarming, went largely unaddressed. Dahmer's interest in the morbid went unnoticed, buried beneath the surface of a quiet, withdrawn boy who rarely expressed his inner turmoil. By his teenage years, Dahmer's struggle with his identity became a major source of confusion and frustration. Coming to terms with his homosexuality in an unaccepting environment only compounded his feelings of isolation. Around age 14 or 15, Dahmer recalled in an interview, "I started having obsessive thoughts of violence intermingled with sex, and it just got worse and worse. These fantasies grew increasingly vivid, blending intimacy with violence, and created a growing obsession within him that he struggled to control." For Dahmer, control became everything. Unable to find acceptance or a sense of power in his life, he began to fantasize about ways to impose his will on others fully, imagining a world where he could command others without fear of rejection. In 1978, Dahmer acted on these dark impulses for the first time. While still a teenager, he picked up 18-year-old hitchhiker Stephen Hicks, bringing him back to his home under the pretense of having a few drinks. When Hicks eventually wanted to leave, Dahmer, unwilling to let go, bludgeoned him with a barbell, strangling him and later dismembering his body. This first kill ignited something in Dahmer that he struggled to comprehend. Once it happened the first time, he admitted, it just seemed like it had control of my life from there on in. The compulsion to do it grew stronger, and he described reaching a point where he no longer resisted his dark urges. In his words, after the second time, he didn't even try to stop it after that. As Dahmer's killing spree continued, he developed rituals that went far beyond murder. He chose his victims carefully, targeting men he found attractive, what he described as the best-looking guys he could find. His need for dominance grew into something even more sinister. To him, killing was just a step toward his true goal, complete possession. "I just wanted to have the person under my complete control," Dahmer said, "not having to consider their wishes, being able to keep them there as long as I wanted." This need led him to practice necrophilia and cannibalism, acts that he saw as ways to make his victims a permanent part of me. Dahmer's acts of cannibalism and attempts to preserve parts of his victims were driven by an obsession with creating a world where he held the final say. He described these acts as sexual satisfaction that filled his void. By consuming his victims, he felt he was taking something from them, making them a part of himself forever. His rituals of control, dissection, and preservation allowed him to create my own little world where I had the final say. In interviews after his arrest, Dahmer often reflected on his actions with a disturbing calm, as if still trying to understand the compulsion that had overtaken him. He described his crimes not as the result of external factors, but as something that had grown from within him, a force too powerful to resist once he had taken that first life. His need for control, initially shaped by feelings of isolation and powerlessness, had spiraled into a force that consumed him. Jeffrey Dahmer's story, in his own words, reveals a glimpse into a mind consumed by darkness, a mind that yearned for control over others in the most horrifying ways imaginable. His crimes remain a grim reminder of how isolation, unchecked compulsions, and unresolved inner conflicts can lead to unimaginable horror. Number 9. Ted Bundy. 17 hours before his execution, Ted Bundy sat down for his final interview with Reverend James Dobson, an evangelical minister who had come to hear Bundy's account of why he had committed some of the most infamous murders in American history. The man known as Theodore Robert Bundy was by this point a nationally recognized serial killer, a man who had confessed to taking the lives of at least 30 young women across 7 states between 1974 and 1978. Bundy, who had once appeared charming and outwardly charismatic, was ready to share his own twisted explanation. "What's going through my mind right now," Bundy began, "is to use the minutes and hours that I have left as fruitfully as possible." He wanted to set the record straight, to explain why he had ended up the way he did. Unlike many killers who blamed their crimes on difficult childhoods or abusive upbringings, Bundy claimed that he had come from an ideal, loving family. "I grew up in a wonderful home with 2 dedicated and loving parents," he told Dobson. For him, the origin of his violent behavior lay elsewhere. In Bundy's view, his journey to murder had started with an unexpected but powerful influence: pornography. He recounted his first encounters with it when he was 12 years old, finding magazines with graphic images on drugstore shelves. Bundy described this early exposure as a gateway, leading him into darker, more explicit content. By his teenage years, he was actively searching for more graphic materials, becoming almost obsessive in his pursuit of increasingly explicit images. "The people would dump the garbage, and whatever they're cleaning out of the house," Bundy recalled. "From time to time, we'd find pornographic books of a harder nature." For Bundy, these discoveries fueled what he described as a dangerous thought process that would ultimately shape his violent behavior. "It fuels this kind of thought process," he claimed. "Once you become addicted to it, you keep looking for more potent, more explicit, more graphic kinds of materials." For Bundy, pornography became an insatiable hunger, an addiction that constantly pushed his boundaries. Eventually, he reached what he called the jumping-off point, where merely viewing or reading graphic content wasn't enough. In a chilling moment of self-reflection, he explained, "You begin to wonder if maybe doing it will give you that which is just beyond reading about it and looking at it." Despite the weight he placed on pornography's influence, Bundy was careful to avoid directly blaming it for his actions. "I'm not saying it caused me to go out and do certain things," he clarified. Instead, he described pornography as something that molded and shaped the kinds of violent behavior that would soon take over his life. His words were both an admission and a veiled deflection, an attempt to place some responsibility on the influence of violent media while absolving himself of complete blame. But Bundy's path to murder involved much more than addiction to pornography. His crimes were carefully calculated, and he developed a method to trap his victims, often preying on their empathy. Bundy would pose as a man in need, sometimes wearing a sling or pretending to have an injured leg. His victims, seeing what appeared to be a harmless man in need of help, would offer assistance, only for Bundy to overpower them. His charisma and good looks helped him gain his victims' trust, making his crimes all the more insidious. Bundy's ability to separate his public image from his darker impulses was astonishing, even to seasoned psychologists. He appeared well-educated, intelligent, and sociable, qualities that masked his violent tendencies and allowed him to evade detection for years. He pursued a law degree, involved himself in politics, and even had a long-term girlfriend. All the while, he harbored sadistic fantasies that eventually led him to kill. When he was finally apprehended, Bundy continued to manipulate those around him, maintaining his innocence for years while defending himself in court. He played the part of his own attorney, charming some members of the media and the public into seeing him as a wrongly accused man. Only later, when all options had run out, did he confess to his crimes. In the interview with Dobson, Bundy tried to create a narrative of a man led astray by a destructive influence, claiming that his exposure to violent pornography had shaped his mind and urges. But Bundy's true motives likely went deeper, rooted in a need for power and control that he sought through terrorizing and killing young women. His explanation provided only a glimpse into the twisted reasoning of a man who took pleasure in manipulating and harming others. Bundy's final interview was a disturbing reflection of his life, an attempt to explain the unexplainable while carefully avoiding full accountability. His words serve as a chilling reminder of how some killers try to rationalize their monstrous actions, leaving us to wonder if they believe their own explanations or if they are merely continuing to deceive. For Bundy, it was the final act in a lifetime of deception, a desperate attempt to shape his legacy in his final hours. Number 8. Paul Bernardo. Paul Bernardo's story is a harrowing tale of manipulation, cruelty, and an insatiable hunger for control. Known infamously as one half of the Ken and Barbie killers, alongside his wife, Karla Homolka, Bernardo's seemingly charming exterior masked one of Canada's most disturbing criminal minds. But beneath the facade of his Ken persona lay deep-rooted insecurities and a profound desire to dominate others, which he claimed stemmed from a troubled childhood and a fractured sense of self. In the mid-1980s, Bernardo started to gain infamy as the Scarborough Rapist for a series of brutal sexual assaults across the Toronto suburb of Scarborough. By day, he was a young man of good looks, an apparent all-Canadian ideal. By night, he preyed on unsuspecting women, attacking with a combination of charm, force, and brutality. In his twisted mind, these attacks allowed him to feel powerful, compensating for the fears and inadequacies he claimed had plagued him for much of his life. Bernardo later explained that his actions were driven by a desire for power and control. Reflecting on his childhood in court, he spoke of his struggle with insecurity, recalling small moments that left deep psychological scars. "I was the type of guy who would freeze at baseball plays," he admitted. "I didn't want to swing because I knew I was going to miss." These seemingly minor memories, he claimed, built up over the years, creating a sense of helplessness and inadequacy that he would eventually channel into violent, destructive behavior. He described his fear during early jobs, like waiting tables at Mother's Pizza, where even walking up to a table felt daunting. To the court, he portrayed himself as a timid, fearful young man who used violence as a way to mask his own insecurities. His crimes took a more sinister turn when he met Karla Homolka, a young woman who, on the surface, appeared to be the perfect counterpart to his Ken image. Together, they developed a toxic and terrifying partnership. Homolka's compliance and enthusiasm for Bernardo's sadistic urges enabled him to carry out atrocities he may have once only fantasized about. In a shocking act of loyalty to Bernardo, Homolka offered her own younger sister Tammy as a gift to him on Christmas Eve. Bernardo drugged, sexually assaulted, and ultimately killed Tammy, marking the beginning of a dark chapter of escalating violence that would make the couple infamous. After Tammy's death, Bernardo and Homolka continued their spree, luring, raping, and murdering multiple young women across Canada. The couple's crimes were premeditated and methodical, often involving videotaped assaults in which Bernardo displayed his need for total domination. To the public, they were an unthinkable contradiction, a photogenic, seemingly normal couple who were, in reality, ruthless killers with no regard for the suffering they caused. In interviews and court testimonies years later, Bernardo attempted to explain the depths of his actions. For him, the violence was an outlet, a way to overcome his anxieties about sexual performance and fears of inadequacy. "That's what I had back then, so I used sex as a vice," he confessed, suggesting that his sadistic acts were an attempt to feel in control of something, anything in his life. It was a chilling admission, as he acknowledged that his crimes were not merely about physical domination, but about psychological control, erasing his own fears by inflicting them upon others. As time went on, Bernardo found himself trapped in the very prison of control he had tried to build around others. In prison, stripped of his freedom and power, he seemed to recognize the depths of his monstrosity. In a rare moment of self-reflection, he confessed to the police, "I'm the worst piece of crap on the planet." The man who had once taken pleasure in wielding life and death over others had been reduced to a shadow of himself, imprisoned both physically and mentally by his own deeds. While behind bars, Bernardo tried multiple times to appeal his life sentence, pleading for a chance at freedom. Each attempt was met with widespread outrage, as the memory of his crimes remained etched in the minds of Canadians. His attempts at explaining or justifying his actions have done little to soften the public's view of him as a monster, a man who preyed on his own insecurities to justify a reign of terror. Bernardo's story serves as a dark reminder of how deep-seated insecurities, combined with an insatiable thirst for power, can fuel a descent into unimaginable cruelty. His final admission of worthlessness may be the closest he has come to acknowledging the true impact of his actions, a stark contrast to the years he spent inflicting pain on others, forever changing the lives of his victims and their families. Number 7. Anatoly Onoprienko. Anatoly Onoprienko, a man whose name would become synonymous with terror in Ukraine, left a dark legacy as one of the most chilling killers in modern history. Over a 7-year span in the 1990s, Onoprienko's brutal killing spree claimed the lives of 52 innocent people, earning him the notorious nickname the Beast of Ukraine. To those who would later meet him, his cold, unrepentant nature was almost as horrifying as the murders themselves. In an interview with journalist Mark Franchetti, Onoprienko offered a rare and unsettling glimpse into the mind of a man who had committed such horrific acts. "To me, killing people is like ripping up a duvet," he remarked with eerie detachment. His words suggested that murder was, for him, a casual, almost mechanical act, devoid of emotion. For Onoprienko, his victims, whether they were men, women, children, or the elderly, were nothing more than faceless beings, just masses. He saw no distinction, no individuality, and no reason for empathy. "I have never felt sorry for those I killed," he said. "No love, no hatred, just blind indifference." Born in 1959, Onoprienko had a turbulent and troubled life from the beginning. His father, a World War II veteran, was often absent and emotionally distant, leaving Onoprienko's childhood marked by neglect and alienation. By the age of 4, he had been sent to an orphanage, where he spent most of his formative years. The experience left him embittered and angry, feelings that would only grow as he got older. A string of minor crimes in his youth hinted at a penchant for rebellion and violence, but nothing foreshadowed the horror he would one day unleash upon Ukraine. As he entered adulthood, Onoprienko found himself drifting, unable to hold a steady job or form meaningful relationships. He often traveled between towns and villages, living a nomadic existence that further distanced him from society. In time, he began to believe he was meant for something greater, something dark and destructive. He claimed to feel driven by an external force, something he described as telepathic or cosmic, a higher power that compelled him to kill. "I am being groomed to serve Satan," he told Franchetti. According to Onoprienko, his actions were not his own, but dictated by a malevolent influence that he could neither resist nor understand. He was merely a vessel, a tool meant to fulfill an unknown purpose. Throughout his life, Onoprienko claimed to receive these orders, guiding him in his violent acts. His twisted ideology allowed him to separate himself from his deeds, viewing each murder as a task assigned to him rather than a choice. This belief extended even to his family. He admitted that he once harbored a strong desire to kill his brother's wife, a woman he despised. Yet he refrained from doing so, explaining, "I wanted to kill her, but I couldn't because I had not received the order. I waited for it all the time, but it did not come." In his mind, his monstrous acts were justified by this invisible authority, rendering him nothing more than an instrument of fate. Onoprienko's killing spree escalated with each new crime, evolving from random murders to full-scale massacres. He would break into homes, often late at night, slaughtering entire families with ruthless efficiency. Using a combination of firearms, knives, and blunt objects, he ensured that no one was left alive to identify him. He became infamous for his brutality, showing no mercy even to the youngest members of his victims' families. As his body count rose, so did the terror he inflicted upon Ukrainian communities, who lived in constant fear of the unknown killer who could strike at any time. Despite the horror he inflicted, Onoprienko remained completely unrepentant. During his interview, he expressed a chilling lack of remorse, even admitting that he would gladly kill again, if ever given the chance. "If I am ever let out, I will start killing again," he said without hesitation. "But this time it will be worse. 10 times worse. The urge is there." His words left no doubt about the depths of his sadism. For him, murder was not only an act, but an addiction, a primal urge that he felt compelled to satisfy. Onoprienko's trial, which captivated Ukraine, revealed details that shocked even the most seasoned investigators. His indifferent demeanor in court, combined with his willingness to recount his crimes in graphic detail, underscored the terrifying disconnect between his actions and any sense of morality. He did not plead insanity or attempt to justify his crimes as anything other than acts of pure, unfeeling violence. For Onoprienko, each murder was a task that he had been assigned, a disturbing ritual that brought him a sense of power and fulfillment. Even in prison, Onoprienko remained unrepentant, holding firm to his belief that he was guided by forces beyond human understanding. His words echoed through the halls of Ukraine's maximum security facilities, a chilling reminder of the darkness that had once roamed freely among the innocent. His case continues to haunt those who study criminal psychology, serving as an example of a killer who viewed life with a chilling sense of detachment and claimed to follow orders from a force no one else could see. Anatoly Onoprienko's story is not merely one of a man who killed, but of a man who saw his murders as a grotesque duty. His declarations serve as a chilling insight into a mind void of empathy, driven by delusions and a thirst for blood that he claimed was beyond his control. His legacy remains a haunting chapter in Ukraine's history, a reminder of how some killers rationalize their violence with forces as dark as the acts themselves. Number 6. Yang Xinhai. Yang Xinhai's name has become synonymous with terror in China. His crime spree remains one of the deadliest in the country's history, with a body count that stands unmatched. Over a short period of just 4 years, Yang murdered 67 people in a series of brutal attacks that left entire communities reeling in fear. His method was as ruthless as it was methodical. He would select isolated rural homes, often those of farmers, enter under the cover of night, and mercilessly slaughter entire families. He showed no mercy, sparing neither women nor children. In many cases, he committed rape before carrying out his murders, leaving behind scenes of unimaginable horror. As Yang's crimes became public knowledge, the media and law enforcement scrambled to find explanations for his actions. Some reports speculated that his killing spree was fueled by heartbreak. One source claimed that a breakup had left him embittered and angry, leading to a profound shift in his view of the world. His girlfriend broke up with him, one article explained, and as a result, Yang developed a vengeful attitude toward society. Other officials described him as an enemy of society, a man who chose to act out of spite. He committed crimes merely to hurt society, a police officer told the press, echoing the sentiment that Yang's actions were an expression of hostility toward the world around him. But Yang Xinhai himself had a much more chilling perspective on his crimes. In interviews following his arrest, he showed no signs of the heartbreak or vengeance that others had attributed to him. Instead, he spoke with an eerie calm, offering a glimpse into the mind of a man utterly detached from humanity. "I have no desire to be part of society. Society is not my concern," he stated coldly before his execution. For Yang, his actions were not about revenge or a vendetta against anyone specific. Rather, they stemmed from an unsettling apathy toward life itself. "When I killed people, I had a desire," he admitted. "This inspired me to kill more. I don't care whether they live or die. It is none of my concern." Yang's criminal history began long before he embarked on his killing spree. Born in 1968 in a poor farming family, he grew up in a life marked by hardship and poverty. He left school early and struggled to find his place in society, bouncing between low-paying jobs and experiencing periodic brushes with the law for petty theft and other minor crimes. By the time he reached adulthood, Yang had developed a deep-seated resentment, one that he nurtured quietly as he drifted from place to place, disconnected from the world around him. When asked about his crimes, Yang's response was as detached as it was chilling. "Killing people is very usual," he said matter-of-factly, "nothing special." In his view, murder was nothing more than a task, a means to an end that was neither extraordinary nor remarkable. He seemed entirely devoid of empathy, treating the lives of others as inconsequential, mere obstacles to be removed. To him, life held no inherent value. It was disposable, transient, and ultimately meaningless. This indifference allowed Yang to kill without hesitation, carrying out his crimes with a precision that left investigators stunned. He would select his targets based on isolation and vulnerability, often attacking farm families in rural areas where they had little chance of summoning help. His method was brutal and efficient. He would typically enter through an unlocked door or window, armed with a hammer or other blunt object, and proceed to bludgeon his victims to death, one by one. In several cases, he raped the women before killing them, a further expression of his need to dominate and control. By the time he left, entire families would lie dead, the homes transformed into silent tombs. The fear that spread through China as Yang's crimes unfolded was palpable. Rural communities became gripped with terror, and families took extreme precautions, locking their doors and windows and sleeping with weapons by their bedsides. For a nation unaccustomed to such rampant violence, Yang's actions seemed like something out of a nightmare, an almost mythic figure of horror lurking in the darkness. Authorities launched a massive manhunt, pouring resources into tracking down the elusive killer who seemed to strike without rhyme or reason. When Yang was finally captured in 2003, the relief felt by the public was matched only by the horror of his confessions. He showed no remorse, no sense of guilt or shame. Instead, he calmly recounted his murders, speaking of his victims as though they were mere objects, existing solely for his own twisted gratification. Even as he faced the death penalty, he remained unrepentant, viewing his impending execution as little more than an inevitable outcome. Yang Xinhai's case remains one of the most disturbing in criminal history, not only for the sheer scale of his violence, but for the cold, calculating detachment with which he carried it out. His life serves as a reminder of how apathy and detachment can manifest into unimaginable cruelty. In his own words, Yang claimed, "Society is not my concern." He saw no value in life, no reason for compassion or connection. To him, killing was simply nothing special, a terrifyingly ordinary act in a world he found devoid of meaning. In his final days, Yang left behind no legacy of remorse, no sign of introspection. His story stands as a haunting example of a mind utterly indifferent to humanity, a life driven by emptiness and devoid of purpose, a chilling, unforgettable portrait of a man who viewed life and death with equal detachment. Number 5. Andrei Chikatilo. Andrei Chikatilo, often referred to as the Butcher of Rostov, remains one of the most notorious serial killers in Russian history, responsible for the deaths of at least 53 people over a span of 12 years. His crimes were not only brutal, but also deeply disturbing, leaving a lasting scar on the nation. Chikatilo's killings were a mix of rage, frustration, and a twisted pursuit of psychological release, a violent catharsis that became his tragic legacy. Born in 1936 in the Ukrainian SSR, Chikatilo's childhood was marked by hardship, fear, and deprivation. Growing up in a time of famine and political oppression, he lived through tales of cannibalism, watching his family struggle in desperate poverty. His early life was overshadowed by constant anxiety and an abusive, oppressive environment. Chikatilo was plagued by physical inadequacies as well. He suffered from chronic impotence, a condition that only deepened his feelings of worthlessness and frustration as he entered adolescence and adulthood. These feelings of powerlessness and humiliation would go on to shape the twisted motives behind his horrific crimes. As Chikatilo grew older, he developed a series of academic aspirations, nurturing dreams of a stable, prestigious career. He studied hard and envisioned himself rising through the ranks to a prominent political position, a career that might finally allow him to escape the nothing life he so resented. But life offered him no such escape. Despite his academic efforts, his career as a teacher was ultimately unfulfilling and fraught with frustrations, and his personal struggles persisted. In his marriage, Chikatilo felt emasculated and trapped, unable to establish intimacy and haunted by feelings of inadequacy. Instead of achieving his goals, he found himself working menial jobs and drifting from station to station. His dreams of power and purpose seemed far out of reach, leaving him disillusioned, defeated, and increasingly resentful. Chikatilo's anger at his circumstances reached a breaking point. His deep-seated feelings of failure and frustration began to transform into dark, violent fantasies. He started to view certain people as low-class elements, individuals who, he felt, reminded him of his own unfulfilled life and perceived inadequacies. Often, he encountered drifters and outcasts at train stations and public spaces. These individuals, lost, vulnerable, and on society's fringes, reminded him of everything he despised in his own life. Witnessing others engage in acts of intimacy and casual connections heightened his own sense of impotence and rage. "I began to wonder whether these low-class elements have the right to exist," he later confessed. In 1978, Chikatilo's rage spilled over into action. He lured his first victim, a young girl, into a secluded area and unleashed the pent-up fury he had bottled up for years. The attack was frenzied, brutal, and disturbingly intimate. The act of stabbing and mutilating her body brought him what he described as psychological relief, a temporary escape from the anger and despair that had long festered within him. The act satisfied him in ways he couldn't understand but craved to repeat. As his murders continued, he discovered that the process of killing granted him a dark sense of satisfaction. "When I used my knife," he admitted, "it brought psychological relief." Chikatilo's murders became increasingly grotesque, marked by disturbing rituals and extreme violence. He would gouge out his victims' eyes, chew off their organs, and stuff dirt and debris into their bodies. These acts, he claimed, were part of the frenzy that overtook him during the killings, a transformation he described as becoming a beast or wild animal. As he led his victims into the woods, Chikatilo would feel his body tense with anticipation, his hands shaking as he approached his prey. "I would start to shake. It was like a fever," he later described, attempting to explain the uncontrollable excitement that overcame him before each attack. The act of murder brought him a sense of power and control, feeding his warped need for domination. The connection between violence and arousal became central to Chikatilo's actions. His crimes brought him an unusual mix of sexual satisfaction and psychological release, both of which he described with disturbing frankness in court. The murders, for him, were more than just acts of violence. They were personal rituals that temporarily healed the gaping wounds of his own psyche, filling the void left by years of impotence and inadequacy. In his twisted logic, each life he took seemed to affirm his own sense of worth, however fleetingly. In 1990, after years of evading the authorities, Chikatilo was finally captured, and his trial captivated Russia. He confessed to his crimes with a disturbing lack of remorse, speaking about his actions as though they were the inevitable result of a lifetime of suffering and frustration. In a rare moment of self-reflection, he acknowledged the darkness within him. "I know I have to be destroyed," he admitted to the court. "I understand. I was a mistake of nature." These words were both chilling and oddly resigned, a reflection of a man who saw himself as a product of forces beyond his control. During the trial, Chikatilo's demeanor was a shocking contrast to the monstrosity of his crimes. He spoke with calm detachment, explaining his actions as if he were recounting routine events. His confession gave the court a glimpse into the mind of a man who had come to see himself as something less than human. A mistake who acted out of compulsion rather than choice. He described the murders as both a necessity and a compulsion, a response to urges he felt powerless to resist. The lack of empathy, combined with his chillingly clinical explanations, painted a portrait of a man who saw the lives he took as expendable, tools to satisfy a dark and insatiable need. In 1994, Andrei Chikatilo was executed, bringing an end to the life of one of Russia's most infamous serial killers. Yet his story endures as a haunting reminder of how unaddressed trauma, frustration, and feelings of inadequacy can evolve into something monstrous. Chikatilo's case remains one of the most disturbing in criminal history, not only for the brutality of his acts, but for the twisted justifications he offered. A man who saw murder as a means of achieving relief and domination over a life he could never fully control. His final admission to the court, "I was a mistake of nature," reveals the haunting self-awareness of a killer who had come to accept his place as an outcast, a man defined by his crimes and ultimately destroyed by them. Number 4. Charles Cullen. Charles Cullen, a nurse entrusted with the care of vulnerable patients, became known as the Angel of Death for a chilling reason. Over 16 years, Cullen quietly took the lives of at least 30 to 40 people, although investigators believe the true count may be far higher. He wielded his access to medication like a silent weapon, administering lethal doses to patients who would never suspect that their trusted nurse was, in fact, their executioner. For nearly 2 decades, Cullen's actions went undetected as he moved from hospital to hospital, leaving behind a trail of mysterious deaths that puzzled doctors, nurses, and grieving families alike. Born in New Jersey in 1960, Cullen's early life was marked by hardship and instability. He was the youngest of 8 children, and his father died before Charles even turned a year old. His mother, whom he adored, was killed in a car accident when he was a teenager, leaving him with a profound sense of loss that would shape the rest of his life. Cullen struggled to find a place in the world, often feeling isolated and misunderstood. He served briefly in the U.S. Navy, but his service ended in disgrace, and he later pursued nursing, a profession he hoped would bring him a sense of purpose and stability. However, as he began his career, Cullen was haunted by a profound sense of inadequacy and emotional instability. Working long hours in high-stress hospital environments, he often found himself overwhelmed, drifting further into depression. But instead of seeking help or addressing the unresolved traumas from his past, Cullen's inner turmoil transformed into a dark compulsion. He began to take lives, rationalizing his actions in a way that only deepened the horror of his crimes. Cullen claimed he killed to ease suffering, a justification that he repeated to reporters, police, and anyone who asked why he did what he did. "I thought that people weren't suffering anymore," he once told a reporter. "In a sense, I thought I was helping." It was an explanation that many found baffling, especially given the profiles of his victims. Unlike someone driven by a twisted sense of mercy, Cullen was no Dr. Kevorkian. He didn't select patients who were terminally ill or in unbearable pain. Instead, many of his victims were relatively healthy, people with families, with years of life left to live. Some were on the brink of recovery, others were receiving routine care. Confronted with this contradiction, Cullen's facade of justification quickly unraveled. His reasoning seemed thin, a hollow attempt to paint his actions as somehow benevolent. In one interview, pressed to explain why he targeted patients who were not suffering, he seemed at a loss for words. "My goal here isn't to justify what I did," he eventually replied. He fumbled with his thoughts, his rationalizations crumbling under scrutiny. "The only thing I can say is that I felt overwhelmed at the time. It felt like I needed to do something, and I did." His words exposed a man who didn't fully understand his own motives, a man driven by compulsions he could barely articulate. As his crimes continued, Cullen moved from hospital to hospital, often quitting or being dismissed under mysterious circumstances. Suspicious patterns followed him, but due to weak internal reporting systems, he managed to evade capture. Hospitals, wary of liability, rarely shared their suspicions with one another, allowing him to slip through the cracks time and again. Each new position offered him a fresh start and a new set of unsuspecting patients, and so he continued his deadly routine, undeterred by the growing number of lives he ended. If he hadn't been caught, Cullen later admitted, "I don't know really if I would have stopped." The way he killed was as subtle as it was deadly. He would administer lethal doses of medications, often insulin or digoxin, drugs that could cause heart failure or other catastrophic bodily reactions. These drugs were often untraceable, and the cause of death would be attributed to a sudden, unexpected complication, leaving little evidence that foul play was involved. Cullen operated in the shadows, relying on the trust patients and staff placed in him as a caregiver to mask his lethal intentions. When Cullen was finally apprehended, the breadth of his crimes stunned the medical community and the public. His case exposed serious flaws in hospital reporting practices and left families grappling with the haunting realization that their loved ones had been killed, not by illness, but by a man whose job it was to protect them. During his trial, Cullen appeared withdrawn, occasionally muttering his flimsy justifications for why he had taken so many lives. His demeanor was unsettling. He was neither boastful nor remorseful. Instead, he seemed indifferent, as though his actions were merely the outcome of some inexplicable need, a compulsion he couldn't explain even to himself. For Cullen, Each life he took seemed to serve as a temporary balm for his own inner chaos, a way to assert some sense of control in a life he felt was slipping out of his grasp. His chilling admission that he needed to do something exposed a deep-seated desire to fill an emotional void through violence. He was a man who found solace in the act of killing, even if he couldn't fully understand why. In 2006, Cullen was sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Yet the legacy of his crimes endures, prompting sweeping changes in hospital procedures and leading to the implementation of tighter monitoring of medical staff. Cullen's case remains a haunting reminder of how easily a person in a position of trust can exploit that role, turning a place of healing into a chamber of death. Charles Cullen's story is a grim tale of a man who became an angel of death, a nurse who exploited the very trust he had earned to carry out his twisted compulsion. His hollow justifications, his lack of remorse, and his chilling admission that he would have continued killing if not caught, all paint the picture of a man whose darkness ran so deep that even he could not fully comprehend it. Number 2. Tommy Lynn Sells. Tommy Lynn Sells, often referred to as the coast-to-coast killer, is one of America's most chilling serial killers, responsible for the brutal deaths of at least 22 people across the country. He roamed the nation for nearly 2 decades, leaving behind a trail of victims and shattered families. Sells himself offered an eerie insight into his compulsion, likening the thrill of killing to the powerful rush of a drug. "The first time I did a shot of dope, it was the best feeling I ever had in my life," he told ABC News. "The first time I killed somebody, it was such a rush. It was just like that, a shot of dope every time I did it. It was that rush again, and I started chasing that high." Born in 1964, Sells' life was marred by violence and instability from the very beginning. Raised in poverty, he endured physical and emotional abuse, struggling through a childhood rife with neglect and hardship. By age 7, he was exposed to horrific trauma when he claimed he was sexually assaulted by a trusted family friend. This experience left him deeply scarred, unable to form healthy connections or develop a stable sense of self. In and out of foster care and juvenile facilities, he eventually slipped through the cracks of the system entirely, embarking on a life of petty crime, vagrancy, and violence. As Sells moved into adulthood, his life became an endless search for instant gratification. He developed a crippling addiction to drugs, a habit that fueled his drifting lifestyle and pushed him deeper into crime. Drugs offered him a temporary escape from the demons of his past, but the satisfaction was fleeting. He began to crave something stronger, something more intense, a sensation that could match the rush he felt with his first hit of heroin. And that's when he found murder. Sells' first documented killing took place in 1980 when he murdered a man who had offered him a place to stay. The violence of that first kill brought a feeling he would later describe as euphoric, an adrenaline surge unlike anything he had ever known. It was, he said, just like a shot of dope, an intense rush that left him wanting more. From that point on, he would spend the next 20 years chasing that high, his addiction to murder consuming him in the same way drugs once had. One of Sells' most notorious crimes occurred in 1999, when he entered the home of a family in Del Rio, Texas. He crept into the bedroom of 13-year-old Kayleen Harris, who was asleep in her bed. With chilling precision, he stabbed the young girl 16 times, leaving her to die in her own room. In a stroke of tragic luck, Sells left the scene without realizing that there was another child in the house, 10-year-old Crystal Surlees, who witnessed the attack and miraculously survived despite a slashed throat. Crystal's testimony would later be instrumental in bringing Sells to justice, but the horror she endured that night would never fade. By the time he was arrested, Sells had already killed at least 21 more people, often targeting the most vulnerable: children, women, drifters, and those who lived on society's margins. His murders were characterized by extreme brutality, showing little regard for the lives he took. He later explained that he did not kill out of hatred or anger, but simply to satisfy a need he could barely control. "I don't have an on and off switch," he confessed. "I'm just after that drug. I'm after that feeling." For Sells, murder had become a compulsion, an addiction, as powerful as any narcotic. Sells spoke openly about the mechanics of his kills, describing in disturbing detail the final moments of his victims. "I like to watch the eyes fade, the pupil fade," he said without a trace of remorse. "It's just like setting their soul free." His words revealed a twisted sense of power and control, as if he believed he was somehow releasing his victims from life. For him, watching someone die wasn't just an act of violence, it was a ritual that brought him satisfaction, a dark ceremony that fed his need for dominance. In interviews from prison, Sells seemed almost detached from the horror he had caused, viewing his murders as a series of isolated events rather than a long, bloody spree. He spoke of his crimes in a matter-of-fact tone, as though recounting routine moments rather than the deaths of innocent people. When asked if he would have stopped if not for his arrest, he admitted, "I don't know really if I would have stopped." The honesty of his statement revealed a man without remorse, a man driven by a need he barely understood himself. Sells' confessions sent shockwaves through law enforcement and the communities he had terrorized. For years, he had evaded capture by moving constantly, committing murders in various states and leaving little evidence behind. His nomadic lifestyle made him difficult to track, and his victims were often chosen at random, making it nearly impossible to establish a pattern. The arrest and subsequent conviction of Sells brought closure to some families, but many more questions remained unanswered. How many lives had he truly claimed? How many families had been devastated by a man who saw murder as nothing more than a thrill? In 2014, after years on death row, Tommy Lynn Sells was executed by lethal injection in Texas. As he faced his final moments, he remained unapologetic, refusing to offer any last words to those he had hurt. His story serves as a haunting reminder of how a person can spiral into darkness, consumed by addiction, and driven by a need for power and control that knows no boundaries. His case remains one of the most disturbing in American history, a tale of a man whose addiction to violence left countless lives shattered, and whose cold indifference in the face of his crimes is a chilling glimpse into the mind of a killer who felt no remorse, only the thrill of the kill. Number 1. David Berkowitz, the son of Sam. In the blistering summer of 1977, David Berkowitz, a name now infamous across New York City and beyond, instilled terror as the son of Sam. Over a series of brutal shootings, he killed 6 people and wounded 7 more, targeting young women and couples sitting in parked cars. His killings seemed random, and his notes taunting the police and the media only heightened the fear sweeping through the city. For months, the residents of New York lived under the shadow of a relentless, faceless predator who struck without warning, igniting a panic that left the city paralyzed. The story that emerged after his arrest was as bizarre as it was disturbing. Berkowitz claimed that his neighbor's dog, possessed by a demon named Sam, had commanded him to kill. Sam supposedly communicated through the dog, directing Berkowitz's murderous spree. For years, the chilling image of a man driven to murder by a talking dog dominated public perception, cementing Berkowitz as an almost mythical figure of madness. But in later years, as he began speaking more openly about his life and his crimes, a different picture began to emerge. A portrait not of a man pushed solely by supernatural delusions, but of someone deeply tormented by inner demons long before he picked up a gun. In an interview with Larry King 25 years after his arrest, Berkowitz reflected on the forces that led him down a path of destruction. "It goes back, really, to childhood and the struggles I had as a child. Many psychological problems growing up," he explained. His early years were marred by feelings of rejection and instability. Adopted as a child, Berkowitz struggled with questions of identity and belonging. Despite the love shown by his adoptive mother, his childhood was filled with deep psychological scars. He suffered from bouts of depression and experienced frequent suicidal thoughts. This emotional turmoil only worsened as he entered adolescence, feeling increasingly isolated and haunted by dark thoughts that he couldn't fully understand. In his adult years, Berkowitz drifted, unable to find stability or purpose. His life became marked by periods of intense loneliness, feelings of unworthiness, and a sense of growing disconnection from reality. Searching for some form of belonging or meaning, he found himself drawn to the occult and began dabbling in Satanism, immersing himself in a world that offered him a sense of power he had long felt was missing from his life. Berkowitz admitted that during this time, he felt as if he were no longer fully in control of his actions. "At this time, I had made a pact with the devil," he told King. "I had allowed this satanic thing to control me, and I felt these paranormal powers." For a man who had spent most of his life feeling weak and vulnerable, this newfound sense of invincibility was intoxicating. "I felt somehow invincible. I felt that I had this power," he confessed, adding that, unknown to me, I was slowly being led down a path of destruction. The feelings that accompanied this invincibility, however, were not a source of joy or fulfillment. Instead, Berkowitz described a sense of being trapped, as though he were a brainwashed robot, his actions dictated by something beyond his control. "I just felt something else was controlling me," he explained. In his mind, killing had become a duty, a horrifying compulsion that felt both inevitable and insurmountable. "I thought that killing was what I was supposed to do," he told King, as if his life had been reduced to a singular terrible purpose. Despite his claims of being driven by dark forces, Berkowitz eventually distanced himself from the demon dog story, suggesting that his initial account was more the product of mental instability than genuine belief. As he spent more time in prison, he began to view his actions with a clearer, more reflective mind, recognizing the horror of what he had done. "I don't dwell on it at all," he said quietly to King. "It was a horrible thing. It was a horrible thing." For David Berkowitz, prison became a place of reluctant introspection. Removed from the chaos and darkness that had consumed his life, he confronted the reality of his crimes and the irrevocable damage he had caused. Though he maintained that he had been under a form of psychological control, he stopped using that explanation as a shield. He no longer sought to excuse his actions, but instead expressed a sorrowful acceptance, an acknowledgement of his responsibility in tearing apart the lives of innocent people. In the years following his interview with King, Berkowitz remained in prison, finding religion and dedicating his life to faith, a decision that seemed to give him a sense of peace he had lacked in his earlier years. He embraced the moniker of the Son of Hope, shedding the identity of the son of Sam, and attempting to use his story to caution others about the dangers of darkness and isolation. Though he still refrained from making excuses for his actions, he expressed a desire to make amends, as limited as his opportunities were. Through letters, he reached out to those affected by violence, hoping to prevent others from succumbing to the kind of despair that had defined his own life. Berkowitz's story is one of deep contradictions. A man driven by darkness, yet seeking redemption. A killer who later rejected the very explanations he once used to justify his crimes. While some view his turn to faith as genuine, others see it as yet another attempt to reframe his life, a final grasp at meaning in a life filled with pain. Regardless, Berkowitz's words remain hauntingly resonant. In a quiet moment with King, he looked back on his life and crimes, acknowledging the horror he had unleashed upon the world. "It was a horrible thing," he repeated, almost as if trying to absorb the weight of it himself. As the son of Sam, Berkowitz terrorized an entire city, a man consumed by hate and haunted by delusions of power. But behind the infamous moniker was a deeply troubled individual, a person shaped by years of rejection, loneliness, and mental illness. His journey from serial killer to repentant prisoner offers a glimpse into the complexities of a mind ravaged by darkness and driven by forces even he struggled to understand. His story serves as both a warning and a reminder of the fragile line between despair and destruction, a line he crossed irrevocably on those summer nights in 1977, leaving behind a legacy of fear, sorrow, and, perhaps, for him, a distant hope of redemption. Thank you for joining me on Creepshow. As we've seen, these killers' words offer disturbing glimpses into the darkest parts of human nature, showing us motives that are as chilling as the crimes themselves. If today's stories left you unsettled, or if there's another case you'd like us to cover, let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss our next dive into the shadows of true crime. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, sometimes the scariest stories come straight from reality.